This is problematic on a number of levels. Hi, everyone. Hoping that you all are doing well. We're going to be addressing Set, the Hebrew demiurge. Let's talk a little bit about what a demiurge is, and then we will go into looking at how this is laid out in Scripture. First of all, a demiurge is considered a sort of subordinate deity that creates or arranges the physical world. And so this entity is understood as a craftsman. We've been talking about that before. And in this instance, we were talking about a master craftsman or a master architect. And sometimes these entities historically have included those individuals that would be considered public leaders or public servants. And so the demiurge is often an entity that is all about chaos and then creating order out of the chaos. And so they arrange the world in an orderly fashion according to these narratives. This includes creating animated entities. So the anima. This would include human beings and also other animals. Now, we've talked about this also, about this dualism with relationship to Set or Seth. And so that's also a part of this demiurge dynamic. With the demiurge, this entity is presented as a malevolent agent, and this is distinct from what would be considered a supreme deity, a deity that is a positive deity. And so there's this duality going on here. The other entity is the supreme one, though, that created even the demiurge. Now, what's noteworthy about Genesis 1:1 is hidden in plain sight. In Genesis 1:1 is this narrative that presents a demiurge dynamic with Set being the creator or the maker. Set in this narrative is not only the creator of Adam, but also these lesser deities, these masculine deities known as Elohim. And so Set as demiurge, however, is yet again presented as having feminine characteristics. So we're going to look at exactly how this is laid out in the scripture. So what we are looking at here is Genesis 1:1, and we are looking at this very discrete part of Genesis 1:1, the first word or the first construct in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, and it is this word Reshith. And we're going to deconstruct this so that you can see exactly what's going on here. This is the first word again that is in Genesis, and so it is 1:1:1. This construct of Reshith has a few etymology paths. There's one path that relates to the word or the construct of Resh or Rosh, and you can see the tracing of that. What's interesting about that, though, is there are different pathways for that word or that construct, Rosh, and so that's even going in different directions. We have the one direction that indicates head of something, but there's also another direction with this word Rosh that we're going to look at. And then there's also this identity of Reshith being related to Set very directly. And so you have this pronunciation in terms of the phonetic pronunciation that goes along with Set, and then there's another etymology dynamic that takes you down that Rosh pathway. We're going to be looking first at the Set pathway. And this is what you're going to see when we go down the Set pathway. In the beginning, we basically have this word, this construct, Sheath. And when you separate it out that way, you can very clearly see the Set entity in this particular construct. And this is, again, Genesis 1:1. This is the very beginning. This is that primordial dynamic that we've been talking about. And so here in this Hebrew narrative in Genesis 1:1, we find at Strong's 7225 this construct of in the beginning. Now, in this particular narrative, in the beginning is referring to this idea of being chief, again, head. However, what's interesting about this, and again, this is the first construct that is in Scripture, is that this isn't really a preposition type of dynamic. It's presented as a feminine noun. And so this idea of chief or beginning is a feminine noun. And the pronunciation is Ray sheath. And so this is important to keep in mind because now we are working with an entity in the very beginning. So there's an entity that is serving as the first word or the first construct in the book of Genesis 1:1. Now, if you need to, you might want to look back at some earlier discussions where we broke this down with respect to set. Now, what we find here with this ray sheath is set yet again, okay? And so I've already indicated this is problematic on a number of levels. And so this first word, this first construct, this ray sheath is referring to Set. It is Set's name. And so you see these various transliterations related to Set here. And you can also see that it is relating to words such as Sattani. Remember that. You also have this construct or this transliteration that is that Sutek or that Setek. And that's another name for Set, by the way. And then interestingly, we see this Tani, Tani. And I encourage you to do a little bit of research on that whole construct of tan and Tani. We talked about Taniya before. And so it goes along with this entire idea of the Genesis 1:1 narrative. And so you see a variety of ways of saying set in this particular passage. And so again, you see all of these variations, these transliterations that are inconsistent with what you would be expecting in Genesis 1:1. And so what we have right here in Genesis 1:1 is the construct of what is called the adversary or the enemy being up front and center. This is consistent with that Hova, Hava, Ava, all of those indications of chaos and disorder and violence. And so it's consistent with all of that that previously might have seemed out of place in terms of what we were reading about Scripture. And so now we're going to quickly look at the breakdown of the lexicon so that you can see more clearly how this whole thing is playing out. So we're going to look at not only ray sheath, but what's surrounding it. And here, of course, you see at 7896 this sheath. And again, sheath meaning put and set. It's right there in the name. And here you can see this interesting lexicon dynamic going on. So what you see here is in the beginning created God. Okay. Now, when you are reading this in terms of a regular translation, it's not reading in that way. It's basically reading as in the beginning God created, but that's not really the way that this is written. And so what you have here is that Reshith created, and then Elohim specifically. And so that Reshith, that in the beginning is really Reshith, it's a noun that is feminine and singular. So you have this feminine singular entity that created this plural entity, and it's understood as masculine. So the Elohim, which is the masculine version of the Eloah, which is feminine. So there are these lesser deities that have been created in this very first sentence. So the first thing that was created was the Elohim. Then the heavens. Interestingly, the heavens, that's another word for Shem. And so this feminine singular deity created the Elohim and Shem, which is also related to the heavens, and that's a masculine plural noun. And then you have and the earth, which is supposed to be a feminine singular noun. We're going to look a little bit more closely at it so that you can see it a little bit more clearly in terms of that top part. And so now let's put in the translation, the original wording. And so what you have here is not in the beginning that we have here in English. What we have is that Reshith created Elohim. Okay, so we have Set created the Elohim. And again, the first one is a singular feminine noun, and then you have the masculine verb created, and then you have Elohim. And again, that's a masculine plural coming from the Eloha. Now, you always know it's going to be really interesting when there is a refusal to give the English translation, and that's what we have going on here. And so it's detecting the Hebrew, but when going into the English, you see more Hebrew letters, and so you don't see the actual English translation. And so we had to actually break this apart in order to get the entire translation or transliteration. And so that's how you get to set, is by breaking it apart. You can see it with the phonetic spelling and you can see it in the transliterations, but in terms of that direct translation, this was not wanting to give a direct translation. Primarily, of course, perhaps because of the direct translation. But here, as you can see, when you separate it out, you have the sheath. You have the part that is the sheath in the ray sheath. And again, you already know that this is one of the transliterations of set. This is one of the translations of set. And here you can see additional transliterations. And what's also interesting about this is that when it is spelling that sheet or sheath part, that it is capitalized in a number of instances. And you can see that very clearly on the screen. You can also see some very interesting transliterations in addition to the ones that we just looked at. But ultimately, this is set. This is set. This is Seth. This is Sutek, Setek, and all sorts of other words. Now, this same dynamic with this ray sheath comes up again in Genesis 10:10. So you have Genesis 1:1 and then Genesis 10:10. This same construct comes up. Now, the reason why it's not glaring is because of these translation dynamics. And so the translation is muddy, and so therefore it makes the understanding of the entire thing murky. But what you have at Genesis 10:10 is this discussion about Nimrod. And so this is talking about Nimrod, but then you see this interjection with Set in it, and mentioning that Nimrod's kingdom was Babel. Now at 7219, we have this Rosh pathway. What's interesting about Rosh, which is a part of this whole dynamic, this Reshith, is that in this particular instance, Rosh is referring to something that is a bitter or poisonous herb, considered a venom. What this seems to relate to is the narrative about Set, Isis, and Horus. And so there's a narrative about the three of them and lettuce. I will let you do your own research so that you can find out what that's all about. But there is an interaction that goes on in terms of the mythology related to Set, Isis, and Horus, and this venomous, poisonous substance. So this Reshith is tied to this construct of Rosh, and Rosh is tied to this idea of gall, hemlock, poison, and venom. Now, initially, it's talking about a plant, but if you look down, you see that this is even related to the poison or the venom of what? Serpents. Now, many people are distracted from dealing with line upon line, precept upon precept in scripture because they are distracted by all sorts of other socio political issues or histories that are going on. And so, therefore, they are not really studying the word. They don't have teachers and leaders that are actually teaching them what is in scripture. Instead, they are distracting them with all of these extraneous things that have very little to do with the essence of scripture. One focus is often on, there's an obsession with women or females and the dynamics of power and control and all of the social dynamics that go along with feminism, all of these sorts of things. And so there is an excessive focus on that to the exclusion of actually dealing with scripture and teaching the scripture and deconstructing the scripture and getting a handle on what is the scripture talking about? What are we really dealing with? And because people are not being taught properly, they are not understanding what it is that they are believing, what it is that they are worshiping. Many people don't even understand that Set, this Egyptian Set, is a part of the entire worship narrative that is going on. But that is what is going on, and that's what is not being addressed. Again, because people are too busy focusing on low hanging fruit, too busy focusing on narratives related to gender and gender wars and all of that stuff. And those things are very base compared to what people really need to be addressing. Because what I am talking about right now should be no surprise to anyone because the teachers and the leaders should have already taught this, and people should be looking at this and figuring out what the implications are. Because again, this is problematic on multiple levels. And one of the things to consider is that this is coming out of the Old Testament, and there are various religious traditions that are coming out of this. And so this involves the majority of people on the planet. And so these are things that should be considered or taken more seriously by the masses of people that claim that this is their book, that claim that this is their narrative, and even more importantly, that claim that this is their genealogy, this is their actual ancestry. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care, Susan.